So I'd like to ask you a question first. How many of you know someone who carries one of these around all the time? Now, how many of you know someone who carries more than one of these around all the time and probably drinks everything in it all the time? Now just answer that silently in your heads for a moment and think about what this is, what it's made of, and what the possible effects of it are, as I will describe to you. Now, are you that person? I have to ask. If so, then just give me a moment of your time and I will explain some effects of why these little things here can be some of the dangerous atrocities committed by mankind. Now, a water bottle is a sneaky killer, and that's why it's so convenient. That's why many people buy them all the time. They seem to be so underpriced and so convenient and reachable for people to use. And these companies make it seem like their alternative is the only option when compared with tap water. So if you take a look at this slide here, you'll see that there's a bunch of trash, obviously, on this shoreline of some place of indistinct origin. And you'll notice that among the trash you see 2 liters, milk jugs, all the typical stuff. But there's also little water bottles dotted throughout this entire coastline here. And they're very easy to tell because they have those blue caps and they have those straps around them that say Aquafina or Nestle or something of that like. So I'm going to go to the next slide and show you just what some of these things can cause. So this right here is a direct sampling from the Centers for Disease Control. And this is some of the outbreaks of a very deadly virus known as Salmonella due to water bottles. Now, some of these years are very scattered and may seem unrelated, but you can see all of them have that AGI illness, or acute gastrointestinal illness, outbreak in many different years. So here we have 1980, there's 1973, and 1973 is about when the bottled water started up, but that's another story. And here we have 2007, 2010, so all pretty recent, and these are only reported outbreaks, so there have been many outbreaks, but not all of them get the attention they need, especially from a reputed source such as the CDC. So moving on, we have definite signs of BPA in our bottled water, which is bisphenol A. And now, a thing you need to know about bisphenol A is it's something that is in a lot of plastics. Not even just water bottles, but water bottles are some of the more important things you need to worry about with considering BPA, because BPA can cause a lot of different illnesses, such as cancer, breast cancer. It can also cause spermicidal effects in men and cause many hormonal dysfunctions in human beings in general and on tested lab animals. Now, another thing about BPA is that there are currently no restrictions for it. All of the BPA that is used in bottled water is totally, for the most part, untested, especially by the bottled water companies themselves, because in fact they're not required to do their own tests, because the FDA actually controls what goes into the bottles for bottled water. And currently there is only one person at the FDA recording all this and asking for information, which is definitely way too much to handle for one person dealing with Nestle, Aquafina, Pepsi, which actually owns Aquafina, and numerous others. So moving on, here we have a very distinct time frame, or a money count for how much bottled water costs in comparison with tap water. So here you see that a single bottle of water has been statistically shown to add up to $7.50 a gallon. Now, when a study was done on tap water, you see that it's only 1/10 cent a gallon. So obviously, that's a huge difference. In fact, it is 2,000 times more expensive to buy bottled water than tap water. Now, and that's not even considering all the health effects that go with bottled water. But I do have to say that tap water has, in some circumstances, considered to be more dangerous, and sometimes bottled water can be a better choice. But for the most part here, it's more effective to use tap water and more safe because tap water is regulated by the EPA. And that means that every month or week, each tap water plant has to send in a report to the EPA. And that report shows parts per million of certain chemicals and other things that could be or could not be in our tap water. And if some statistics show up higher than others, then they have to do a report on that, file possibly an emergency situation, and shut down the tap water. Whereas with bottled water, as we saw back here with the outbreaks, bottled water companies don't have to file very many reports, so that's why this happens. Now, there have been outbreaks of tap water that have been unforeseen, especially in West Virginia recently with the that chemical spill in the Elk River, but this is definitely a larger scale than that from seeing all these outbreaks, especially going as far back as 1973, and yet they still don't really do much about it. So moving on here, this is one of the most important chemical symbols you need to take a look at. And one of my professors 2 semesters ago in a chemistry and society class showed me this and said that this is what everything in chemistry and science is based around, actually. We all see the periodic table of elements, but rarely do we ever see this on there, which in truth it should be, because this is what affects how everything is done. This little symbol right here. Because what these bottled water companies do is they take how much of this they can get and put that ahead of everything else, and that's why we have the disease outbreaks, and not to mention the environmental factors, which I'll get into in a minute. Now here is the environmental problem. This is where all the bottles are made. This is the source of it. Crude oil, simple crude oil, and here's a picture of what that looks like once it comes out of these things. So this goes into that, and that is what makes up your bottled water. So imagine drinking that, for instance. No one would ever want to drink that, right? I mean, look at it. It's disgusting, dirty. I mean, that person's wearing a glove and they're probably in a hazmat suit. But, funny thing, that's what bottles are made of. Most of our bottled water, and that's where the bisphenol A comes from. So when you drink a bottle of water, while you may not be drinking that in particular, the chemicals from that are contained in the plastic, and water is a very well-known solvent for things. So a lot of things can dissolve in water and seep into water. And that's why water is one of the most easily contaminable liquids on our planet, because it takes things in so well. It takes salt in, takes everything in. And the longer it sits in one of these, the more chemicals that will leak in this. So every day, this bottle here gets more toxic. Now if we look over here, here are some of the environmental effects. Obviously this might be a little overblown. You don't always see trucks this enormous spewing that much smoke, but that's where our bottled water comes from. It goes from here, gets processed into this, and then goes to a plant in this, and is reduced into a bottled water. They take that oil and they turn it into those bottles in a plant, which spews out CO2 and a lot of other greenhouse gases, which we know now are contributing to global warming. And after the bottles are made, they're shipped in these trucks all across the US, which causes many problems, and a lot of bad things can happen just on the road in general, because trucks can get into wrecks a lot, and whenever that happens, you've got a loss in money, and you've got who knows however much CO2 spewing into the atmosphere. And now moving on, this is what I would see an ideal society for a bottled water. This is obviously a cartoony image, overblown, but if you look at it, this is what bottled water is preventing from happening, because with all the chemical pollution, you can look back in the very beginning of this slide and see things like that. And that's what we don't want, and that's why we want to have this, because that promotes a healthier environment, a healthier life, and an overall health benefit for everyone. And now, moving on to a source of action. So you may be asking yourselves, well, what am I supposed to do about it? Like, this is all just a bunch of hoo-ha, like, what are we supposed to do? The bottled water companies are so huge, how can we as people possibly have an effect on it? Well, that's very simple, actually. Now, you may be hard pressed to find out what causes all of this to happen and why these companies are so big. But the simple reason is that it's us, consumers. The consumer demand is manufactured by these companies because they make us think that we need to buy this. Now, when they make us think we need to buy this, we're going to go buy it, no matter what. We ignore everything else, such as the cost effectiveness, the health risks, and environmental risks concerned with this, which I have just discussed in all these slides, seeing the littered coastline and the BPA and the crude oil, all of that. So they manufacture this demand, so we ignore all of that and we buy these bottles for an outrageous price. Now, the simple thing to do that, and which I would like all of you to do if you are so inclined, is to just simply not buy bottled water. That in itself protests against these companies, because when they stop making money on bottled water, they can't possibly continue to thrive, and then they realize that people know better than that. And so, I hope you've gained some valuable information today, and make the right choice. Thank you.